I'm here today with a senior writer and draft expert or prospect expert with the Hockey News and Sports Illustrated. That's Ryan Kennedy. Ryan, how have you been enjoying this return to play with the NHL playoffs?
I think they've done a fantastic job. I really like the game presentation. I think they've done a tremendous job, obviously, with the testing and keeping players safe. And it's been a really fun Stanley Cup run. Watching Dallas as a bit of a spoiler and really playing some top teams with great defensive presence. It's been quite the show. And then obviously Tampa Bay, getting back to the final. I think this was something we've been waiting for a couple of years now.
Especially after last year when they got knocked out. They got swept by Columbus in the first round. And they don't have Stamkos right now, but they're still firing on all cylinders. But he might be back by the end of the series. But like you said, the NHL's done a tremendous job with this event. But the next event, and arguably the event that you're the expert on, the NHL Draft, is on early October. And do you know any details about what that presentation is going to look like?
They haven't said much yet. I would presume that they're probably going to put on a pretty good show. We're all used to Zoom calls now, and I know they're lining up some availabilities with some of the top prospects in preparation for it. So there's going to be some decent media access in the run up to the draft, and I would suspect that you're going to see a nice presentation. I think luckily for the NHL, we've already seen an NFL virtual draft happen. So there's a bit of a template to go off at least.
Well, if we're talking about the NFL Draft for a second here, some of the highlights were the viral ability of that draft. I mean, Belichick's dog coming in, Vrabel had his whole family dressed up. If you were to guess which NHL GM would have the most viral Zoom call, who would that be?
Oh, I think it's got to be Marc Bergevin in Montreal. I mean, that's a guy that steps up to the occasion. He was known as a jokester, as a player, and we've seen his sense of humor come through a couple of times as a GM, just with sort of fun things he's done, and he's a snazzy dresser. So I think he's going to have his war room set up in some sort of stylish way, maybe ironically stylish, maybe just fun. But I'm going to keep my eye on Bergevin.
There'll probably be a couple dumbbells in the corner so he can get his arm curls in between picks.
There you go.
Speaking of the draft, last year the Western League, we had 7 players go in the first round. This year it's a real toss-up, but we have a few players that are what it looks like to be surefire first-round picks. I start with Caden Gooley. He's a defenseman for the Prince Albert Raiders. What about him do you think makes him a top prospect for this year's draft, and how do you think his game translates to the NHL?
Well, with Gooley, obviously the big positive with him is his skating. He has fantastic skating ability, and you look at the NHL today, it's all about mobility, particularly on the back end. He's got really good edges. He pivots well, and he defends very quickly. And, this is a guy that he does have offense in his game, but really more of that two-way guy. He can be physical, closes gaps really quickly. I would say you're getting a little more defense than offense there, but that's certainly not a bad thing. He is a blue liner, and I think there's a lot of translatability in his game because of that skating ability. It's such a good building block to have as a foundation in today's game.
You might not be able to answer this question, but his older brother, Brendan, is also, he's up and down in the NHL, but he was a first-round pick. He's played, I think, close to 100 NHL games. Do you know if NHL teams or NHL scouts, how much weight do they put on the bloodlines of players like a Gooley when they're evaluating his play?
It's certainly a box that they check off, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be in hockey. I think if players come from athletic backgrounds in general, it's seen as a plus, and it could be brothers and sisters, it could be the mom or dad, but any sort of high level activity is seen as a plus. And then of course it is a bonus if you had a brother or a dad who played in the NHL, just because then some of those players, they've been around the NHL dressing rooms before. They know what to expect. They train like pros. So that sort of specialization is obviously key, but yeah, any sort of high level athleticism, I think, is a bonus.
Yeah, you think about in the OHL with Liam Foudy and his parents, how, Olympians and CFL players, it's the bloodlines, that athletic, the high level competition players. Transitioning back to our league, we just talked about a defenseman. Let's talk about a forward now in Portland, Seth Jarvis, who, he was ranked coming into this year's draft, but he's just gone up and up and up. And he had an opportunity to compete for the scoring title in our league had we would have had a full season. But what about Seth's game really caught your eye this year?
Well, it's the great combination of speed and skill. He's an elusive guy, and obviously 98 points in what was a shortened schedule. That's pretty impressive. And talking about, right now, here's a kid that, he likes Braden Point. We see a lot of similarities with Braden Point. Braden Point currently starring for the Tampa Bay Lightning, in the playoffs. And 10, 15 years ago, Seth Jarvis with his size probably would have been relegated to the second round, as Braden Point was when he was originally drafted. But now NHL teams see that it's not really size that's going to matter that much at the NHL level. These guys that, are in that sort of 5'9" to 5'11" range. If you can't catch up to them, you can't hit them and you can't get the puck off them. And, Seth Jarvis, tremendously impressive this year. I really liked him at the CHL Top Prospects game. I thought he acquitted himself very well there. And, this is a player that I think a lot of teams are going to be jockeying for position in that first round and thinking, okay, if he's still on the board at a certain number, do we need to trade up to get him? Because I think there's going to be a lot of suitors for a kid with that package.
His compete level is really what caught my eye when I got to see him play this year in Seattle. I played with Braden Point and Moose Jaw, and, that's a really good comparable for him because they're both undersized guys that when they go on the corners, they always seem to come out with the puck, which was frustrating when you're playing against them. But if you're a team drafting, it's definitely a guy you want. You've been with the Hockey News since 2004 now. You're their prospect expert. What do you, when you're scouting players, how do you go about scouting? And then what's the rubric you use to evaluate these guys and put them into your own lists?
Well, for me, it's definitely a combination of personal viewings and talking with NHL team scouts. And, I have sort of a network of teams or team scouts that are across the globe. And I think that's really important is you want to have people out west that see the dub kids consistently. You want to have guys in Ontario and in the Quebec League, in the States, Sweden, Finland, what have you. So for me, I love to see as many of the kids in person as I can in a given year. And then, I also want to get input from scouts because, they're the guys that are seeing these kids, multiple times. And, if it's a regional scout, he might see them half a dozen, maybe even more times during a season. I also think it's important to see how a kid progresses throughout the year. So, we're talking largely about 17-year-olds and they're still growing into their frames. They're still finding themselves in major junior. And, a kid that is just getting, his footing as a 17-year-old might blossom over the course of 5 months. And I think that's why you really have to take in the whole season or as much of a season as you can and say, how far did this kid have and how far can they still go? You're looking at potential, you're looking at upside. Skating obviously very important these days. Hockey sense is another thing. You're looking at things that you can't necessarily teach. And yes, you can get better at skating, but if you already have that mobility, you certainly have a leg up on the competition.
You're so knowledgeable about these kids and about what teams are looking for. Have you ever had the opportunity to join a team scouting staff, or have you been approached by NHL teams saying, hey, we want you to stop telling everybody else who to draft and start telling us who to draft?
I haven't yet. That would be a very interesting opportunity if it arose, but I have so much respect for the NHL team scouts that are out there. The work they put in, then the knowledge they have, just breaking down, granular skills in these players. You think about the edge work in skating and you think of, breaking down a player's stride. And for me, it's just fascinating to talk to these folks And for them to say like, oh, he's a bit of a knock-kneed skater, he's a bit of a bent-over skater, they really break these things down. And to me, it's fun to tell the stories of these players. And when I get to interview them, I kind of joke, it's like comic books. I tell origin stories, where did this kid come from? And you're going to see them turn into something, potentially great in the next sort of 5 years or so. And that's where I get a lot of enjoyment out of the job.
I love that. The origin story. That's awesome. You talk about those scouts who are seeing these kids every day, that granular development. Well, they get to see players like Tristan Robbins, who at the beginning of the year wasn't really that highly ranked, but has slowly progressed throughout the season up until the shutdown into a guy that could be, a third round, potentially second round pick. So what did Tristan do as another undersized guy to really catch scouts' eyes this season?
Well, I mean, he's the perfect example of a kid that showed progress in his game. And I think the most important thing for scouts was he learned to share the puck more effectively as the year went on. He's a high energy kid. He's got some good skill, but he really built up his game during the year. And, he ended up leading the Blades in scoring, which is obviously a very nice check mark for him. But, he got better. And I think that's the important thing. Like we didn't see him at the CHL Top Prospects game. And now we're seeing him as a player that, has that sort of top 60, top 65 potential. And, talking to scouts, like you said, he's one of those kids where, he might go in the third round, but there might be a team that doesn't want to miss on him and goes for him in the second. And that's sort of the fun of draft day and draft weekend is seeing how teams position themselves to make sure they get the kids they want.
Well, Ryan, 16 years with the Hockey News and now Sports Illustrated. I'm sure you were writing before that, but how did you get into sports writing when you first broke out of university? And why did you choose hockey over any other sport?
Well, I've always been a big hockey fan. And, coming out of university, I did a lot of freelancing where I would write about, basically any subject that interested me or that I thought I could sell. So, a lot of it was music, but some of it was like design or, I even wrote for an airplane magazine. And I don't mean the ones that you read on airplanes. I mean a magazine about airplanes. So I just sort of put myself out there and grinded as much as I could. And then an opportunity, through some folks I knew at the Hockey News came up where I came in and I started as an editor. And from there, I started doing some writing and I was sort of writer/editor. And I just sort of continued on from there and carved out my niche. And, now we have the partnership with Sports Illustrated. So we're all writing stories for the Hockey News and as well as Sports Illustrated's website. So it's an exciting time. And it's been a really fun sort of 15, 16 years.
Well, going back even further, I read an article about you, which was nice to find because most of the articles written by you, which was the difficult part in researching yourself. But you grew up playing punk rock music in a punk rock band. How was that experience? Do you still get to play music is I guess what I'm trying to say here. Are you still able to partake in playing drums in a band, or have you passed that on to your kids?
Well, it's getting to that point. I actually just got a new drum set. I haven't played in a band probably for 12 years or so. But I mean, music's always been a huge part of my life. And, playing in punk bands, it's funny. It's just the whole community and the whole DIY scene. I would say the one part of my personality is that I like to get into whether it be genres or sports and really just sort of surround myself with it as much as possible. So whether it's knowing all the bands that are out there or, when I moved over to hockey, I've always liked hockey. I played at a very low house league level, when I was a kid. But, when I got to the Hockey News, then that became sort of the world that I was most fascinated in. And so, you start off with, you're following junior hockey, and then you say, okay, well, what is there, besides major junior? It's like, well, there's Minnesota high school, there's junior leagues in Sweden and in Russia. It's like, how much of the big picture can you put together? Because it really is kind of a puzzle if you think about the prospect game. And that's, sort of what I'm into right now is just trying to hit every angle possible. And I think that's sort of the fun thing about, you know, a sport like hockey is there's so much to it. And it's such an international game that you can do a lot of very creative things, and you can discover a lot of things that, you know, people don't know about, but might find interesting if you expose them to it.
When it comes to interesting, you've been doing this again since 2004. Who do you think is the one player that he might not have been a first round pick or a second round pick, but he was a player that you said, you know, I really think this guy is going to go on and have a tremendous NHL career? Who's been that guy for you?
Well, I'm certainly gonna pat myself on the back for this one because it was Anthony Cirelli, and this was a player that was not drafted into the OHL. He showed up in Oshawa as a free agent, and I watched him play during his draft year. I'd never heard his name. I was watching the Generals, live in person, and this kid was just always around the play. And I looked at him and I said, you know, this is a kid that makes things happen every time he's on the ice. And I started to ask around, and, speaking with the Generals, they told me his backstory. And right before that Memorial Cup, I wrote an article that said, Anthony Cirelli might be a difference maker. And sure enough, in that final against Kelowna, he had both goals, including the overtime winner, to beat Leon Draisaitl and Josh Morrissey. And then Cirelli went on to get drafted by Tampa Bay, and now we see him now as a kid that's getting Selke votes already in his young career. So I got that one right. I don't get them all right, but I got that one right.
I think he has 3 big overtime winners already in his career, which is pretty impressive for a guy who's only in his 3rd season in the NHL. Well, transitioning back, we just got one more player I'd like to touch on, which would be Brandon Wheat King's Braden Schneider. He's another defenseman. The Western Hockey League in the past has been known for their defensemen. I mean, going all the way back to Double Dion in the 2005. But what does Braden do well, and where do you think he would slot in on an NHL roster?
Well, I definitely think he's a top 4 guy to be sure. And, you know, he might even have the talent to be a number 2 on a team. Great physical game, great defensive player. What I really like about Schneider, you know, he plays a pro game, and he's almost kind of like a safe pick where you look at him and you say, yeah, that's a kid that's going to play in the NHL for a long time. Like, he's got 15 years written all over him. Big body, skates well, you know, has some offense to his game, more of a penalty kill guy, really. But he's strong. And, you know, what I also think is sort of a good omen for him is Hockey Canada loves him. You know, he didn't make the World Junior team, but came pretty close. And, you know, I know speaking to the coaching staff during the training camp, they really liked him. So I think that bodes well for Braden Schneider is, you know, when your country's national team keeps you hanging around and wants you on those national teams, I think that's great for him. And I think he's just a really solid prospect.
Well, that Brandon team next year could actually be one of the top teams in the Western Hockey League. They also have Ridley Grieg on that team, as well as 20-year-old Luca Burzan, who should be coming into his own next season. My last question, though, for you, if you look at the overall draft, you know, what can Western Hockey League fans expect? You know, again, we had 7 first-round picks last year. Don't think we'll see that again this year. But, you know, how many players do you think realistically could come out of the Western League this year?
Well, you know, I think it's probably going to be a similar number. It'll be a pretty standard number, but you're right. It's not going to be a big first round for the dub. You know, you're looking at, Jarvis, Gooley, Schneider. You never know. I mean, you might sneak one more in there towards the end of the round because, you know, I always say it's like 25 to 40. Every year it tends to be kind of a pretty level playing field. It comes down to team preference. You know, so I think you're going to see the standard allotment. And, you know, I haven't broken down the numbers. I don't know if that's 20 players or 25 players or 30 for a typical major junior league. But I think it's going to be a pretty decent year. You know, you're going to see a lot of kids in that kind of 40 to 100 range. You know, I know when I was putting together my rankings, I was looking at guys like Christopher Seedoff and Jack Finley and Luke Prokop, where, you know, they're going to get drafted. It's just a matter of, you know, when. And I think in that sort of middle of the draft, you're going to see quite a few names called. So it's going to be a pretty good year. The high end isn't necessarily there as it has been in some other years, but I think as a whole, it's a pretty decent draft class.
I hate when I do this, but I have one more question for you, even though I just
I
said that's
do,
the
don't
last
worry.
question. But as you were talking, I was thinking about it. One of the most difficult parts of your job must be, I would think, is you're ranking all these players in all these different leagues. So how do you, let's use, if we're talking about the Western League and the AJHL, how would you scout those two leagues differently, or do you scout those two leagues differently? And how do you rank those two players against each other when they're playing in two completely different leagues?
No, it's a great question. And I think you have to look at, the level of competition that these players are facing. And I think each league has kind of its own vibe, and it's a blended list. So, you're thinking about WHL players and you're kind of stacking them against each other. So it's Caden Gooley versus Braden Schneider. It's not those two versus, say, Ethan Edwards from the AJHL. I think when you're talking about the AJHL, for an example, it tends to be players that have really good upside. Maybe they don't have the size just yet. They still need to fill out, and they're going to go the NCAA route afterwards. So you're looking more so for potential there. The players don't have to be as well-rounded because it's more about certain traits they have. So, from there, you're kind of blending the list, and you think about everybody's contributions, and if there is any head-to-head that you can go off, then that's great. Whether it be international competition, did a kid make the World Junior team as a 17-year-old? That's obviously great for them. How many points did they have in their respective league? Like Seth Jarvis is a great example, where at 98 points, he kind of set the standard for draft eligibles in the dub this year. So you look at, the team he played for, how many goals did they score? And you look at some other kids where maybe they were on a team that didn't put up as many goals or whatever it may be. And, it's not a science for sure, but it's kind of fun just to try to figure it all out.
Oh, that's awesome. Again, thank you so much, Ryan, for taking time out of your day. I really appreciate it. All the best to you as the draft comes up here, and I'm sure you're ramping up, getting prepared for it. It should be an exciting day.
Indeed. Thanks for having me.